Hello, I'm Roger Citron, and I'm an associate dean and professor of law at Touro University, Jacob D. Fuchsberg College of Law, and this is a Touro Law Review podcast. I'm delighted tonight to have as our guest the Honorable Mark D. Cohen. Judge Cohen has been affiliated in one way or another with Touro Law Center for decades. Currently, he is the distinguished jurist in residence at Touro Law Center. It's a position he assumed in 2021. And the agenda tonight is twofold. We're going to talk a little bit about Judge Cohen's lengthy and distinguished career in public service. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about criminal law and civil liability with a recent Court of Appeals case, a New York Court of Appeals decision involving no-knock warrants. So with that introduction, Judge Cohen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
And thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And as you said, I've been involved with Touro for now, it's actually close to 30 years. And so it's a delight at all times. And it's a real pleasure to do this podcast.
Yes, well, I want to go back to the beginning for you, which is, why did you go to law school?
My entry into law school was not the normal way. I actually had a career path that was quite different in the beginning. My mother was a child prodigy pianist. She played with the Philadelphia Symphony at age 11. And with that, I studied the cello and was quite good at it, and studied with a series of cellists, and actually at one point studied with a person who was renowned to have been probably the greatest American-born cellist. But my father, who was highly educated, kept saying, why would this person have you as a student? Because you're never going to be a professional cellist. In my college career, made a decision. I could practice this instrument, and I was, to be very frank, not bad at it. But I could practice it for another 10 years, 10 hours a day, and if I were lucky, I'd be third chair in a regional symphony orchestra, because cello jobs for professionals are few and far between. Or I could go to law school, and who knows what will happen. And so I chose the path of law school. I never regretted it. And I'm one who, among so many people who went to law school, who survived the experience of being a lawyer, I loved every minute of every job I had. And to be frank, in my career, as you indicated, I had a very lengthy career in public service. It was over 45 years. But I really only had 3 jobs of any length of time. Out of law school, was a law clerk to an appellate judge in Boston, but then spent the next 25 years in the Suffolk DA's office. And I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. And after that, I was in Homeland Security immediately after the tragedy of 9/11. And I spent 5 years there. And after that, I became a judge. And now I am working more at the law school and actually practicing law for the first time in 45 years. I have a few clients. I work with law firms on a consulting basis. And it's actually been very interesting. And as one colleague told me, I'm lucky. I've hit the trifecta. I was a prosecutor, I was a judge, and now I'm a defense attorney. So my main message to students is law school is a great, great opportunity. And if you seize it and make it such that it provides the means to a job experience that's going to be meaningful and contribute to our community, it's the greatest thing ever. So I've been a lucky person to have looked back and said, you know, that decision not to become a professional musician, my life would have been very, very different. And I've never regretted it for a minute.
I have to say, I've asked this question to a number of people over the years. You may be the first former cellist that
Well,
I've talked to about this
and
subject.
and although my mother was never happy, my mother lived to over 100 and she could perform and did into her 90s on the piano. She was not happy that I neglected the cello during my legal career for over 40 years. I'm now back playing the cello, and I have so loved returning to it. So there is life after a professional career. And if you're lucky, you can return and play the cello. And so I'm a lucky person.
Uh, I love that piece, but I'm going to stay with the law now.
Okay.
And the first major job, you know, the one that you held the longest, of course, was in the DA's office. And there's a couple things that I found so interesting in your bio about that. But for the people who may be listening, who very likely are our current students or maybe recent graduates, can you say a little bit about sort of your experience as a young ADA, how you approach the job, things that you may not have anticipated that you can now reflect on and sort of share with our students, you know, current and
Sure.
former, who may be
Sure.
thinking about going to the DA's office?
Maybe I'll begin by reflecting on the fact that I entered the DA's office not also in the normal way. To be frank, I'm not quite sure I even understood what a prosecutor did. Yes, I took criminal law and I took criminal procedure. I never really held a job during law school as an intern, but one. I worked all year round in law school and in college too as a lifeguard. I worked in the city, in New York City, in a place that had a indoor pool. And in the summers, I would work at a summer camp. I always figured there'd be plenty of time to do legal jobs when I get out of law school. I did take an internship in between my second and third year. And I've also shared with students that one internship, that one job changed my life. It was with the US Attorney here in Manhattan and in the Southern District. And I was lucky. I had an AUSA who was a marvelous teacher. And that summer really taught me this is the meaning of the way a prosecutor should function. And this is how a prosecutor works. I actually left that thinking, you know, it's a pretty good gig. I really have to look into how do I get to become a prosecutor. I finish my third year. I then do the clerkship, and I'm doing it in Boston, but we want to return to Suffolk, which is where we were from. And I interviewed with the Suffolk DA's office, not knowing anybody or anything. But the way I enter, to answer your question, is I'm viewed as an appellate person. After all, I work for an appellate judge. I was a law review person. So I say what most young lawyers say. I really want to try cases. And the first lesson is when you are in a large bureaucracy, even something like a DA's office, the needs of the organization come first. So, of course, where do you think they placed me first? Not in trials. I was placed in appeals. And that lesson was very important because as an appellate lawyer, and frankly, it's now more than 45, 46 years later, if I'm known as anything, I'm known as was an appellate lawyer. I handled hundreds of cases in the state courts, the appellate division, the Court of Appeals, and in the federal courts as well. And what it did was it taught me this is what you have to do if you're going to be part of the larger organization. I also, in my travels, did everything else in that DA's office, from investigative work to trial work, and literally entered as a line assistant and worked my way all the way up through the chain of command to a bureau chief, and then a division head, if you will. And ultimately, I became the chief assistant in my 30s. That doesn't really happen in real life anymore. The office was smaller, and I was a very, very lucky person. I read a book recently about luck and success. You may be the most successful person, but you've got to be in the right place at the right time. And it's been said, luck is the residue of design. I had a design, but my design was do your job well, work very hard, but I'm not sure I ever thought that I would last the 25 years that I did in the DA's office, much less rise through the ranks to become chief assistant. I did learn that they will reward you if you work hard. And that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 1 is always be prepared for an experience that's going to be in an organization that's bigger than you, something that's going to allow you to contribute to your community. And number 2, be prepared for the unknown. You never know what's going to happen, who you're going to meet, and how this is going to impact your life. And that's the notion of luck and success. And so I have had the best career, not only in the DA's office, but also, very frankly, in public service. And again, you may say, after 45 years, how could a person still be energetic and happy about what he does? And it may be part of my problem, and it's a good one. The problem is I like to be happy. I like to also feel that I'm doing some good in this world. And public service is the avenue that I chose. Does that mean that's the answer for everyone? I have a brother who's a lawyer, and I have a son who's a lawyer. Neither one of them ever would have chosen the career path that I did. One became a real estate developer. That's my brother. And my son works in education law for Teach for America, and really not functioning as a lawyer, but for that organization, using those skills. So I guess it fits my category. Choose something that's going to be meaningful, and choose something that's going to be bigger than you, because I think that gives you a notion as to contributing greatly to our community.
We've talked about this before, and of course, I don't want to digress about myself, but having spent a lot of time in public service before teaching, I concur. The piece that really intrigues me that you touched on, of course, is, the chief assistant, if that's the correct title, if I'm using that, in a DA's office. You have, of course, the closest relationship with the district attorney. And so it's an honor that you did it once. I think it may be, I'll say, unusual, maybe even extraordinary that you did it twice. How did that happen?
I will say that I was lucky enough to serve 2 great DAs. I served, they're both now deceased. I served a district attorney named Patrick Henry as chief assistant, and he was not even the DA who hired me. I was hired by a previous DA. And parties don't matter. Actually, I was hired by a DA of a different party than the DA who actually promoted me all the way up to being chief assistant. And you're right. I don't want to, toot my own horn. I'm aware of no one who served 2 elected district attorneys as chief assistant. It's just unheard of. And why is that? If you are the district attorney in a large metropolitan office, you want people around you that you can trust, and you want people who are going to be able to implement your policies. I was lucky to be retained by a district attorney who actually did an extraordinary thing himself. Most DAs, and frankly, it's US attorneys too, when they come in, they replace people at the highest level and then some trickle down. I'll make up a number, 10%, 15% of staff. But in the end, district attorney number 2, whose name was Jim Catterson, took the office as a turnkey. He kept everyone. And what he said was, I didn't know 150 lawyers to replace any of you. And so I don't know you, you don't know me. He'd run from the outside. He'd been an ADA, let me think, 30 years before that. He was a local practitioner who was quite well renowned, certainly very experienced, and he made the decision to retain me. I worked for him for the next 12 years. And the truth is, it was a very, very great experience, but I don't know if I would say it was luck, design, or a combination of all of the above, because it worked. And you're right. Being the chief assistant is like being a law clerk. It's almost like being married. You're with that person all day, every day. Our offices adjoin, and literally he'd walk into mine, I'd walk into his, and we would, in essence, consult on major matters. Obviously, he was the decider. He's the elected district attorney. He'd make the decision. But in the end, I was always accorded deference and full input. And you know how sometimes vice presidents of presidents want to be the last person in the room? I was always the last person in the room with him. And he didn't always follow my advice. Neither did the first district attorney. But in the end, we had the most fabulous of relationships, and it was both DAs. And so I was very, very lucky to be able to do that.
And then I know that the next, I mean, it was literally a quarter of a century, I think, if I ran the numbers correctly. And then you left to go to Homeland Security, which, did I read that correctly? That would have, of course, been a federal position.
No,
was it federal or not?
The ground zero was still smoldering. The word Homeland Security, of course, did not even exist until late September of 2001. Although we were attacked here in New York, the reality is we were the second office stood up as a state office of Homeland Security. And what I like to tell people is, while I was taken on as chief counsel and at that point, assistant director, I was promoted to deputy director at some point. In the creation of the discipline or professional aspect of Homeland Security, there was no book to look at. We as lawyers, we're very good at looking up precedent, and we can look in a book, and I can tell you on the criminal side, I like to say between 70 and 90% what the likely result's going to be. The problem with Homeland Security is we'd never been attacked like this before, and we had no guidebook to go on. When I started, and it was in late fall of 2001, there were 4 people in the State Office of Homeland. It was called Public Security at the time, created by an executive order of the governor. Ultimately, the office is codified. It happens to be in the New York State executive law as the Office of Homeland Security, and it's now part of emergency services and preparedness. And I must say, I was in that office, you know, like Dean Acheson wrote a book, Present at the Creation. I was present at the creation of this thing called Homeland Security. We had a video. I wish I'd retained it. It was an airplane that was half built, and the plane has been launched. We're in the air, wind is blowing, and we're still fixing the wings and the windshield. So we were not making it up, but we were developing the techniques for prevention, deterrence, and response for Homeland Security at the state level. And what I will say is dealing with that was truly, for me, the most challenging aspect of being a lawyer. Don't get me wrong. Being a judge was great. Being a prosecutor was great. And being a professor, it's great. But being in Homeland Security was an area where there was no playbook. So by making it up as we went along, we developed what we'd like to say here in New York became the rubric for what ultimately becomes the giant Department of Homeland Security. Certainly nowhere as big or vast as DHS, but it was the notion of prevention, deterrence, and response. How do we train? How do we deal with the failures of 9/11? And how do we make state and local partners of federal agents? And to that extent, I was a lucky person too. I like to tell people that job taught me, like Dr. Seuss wrote, "Oh, the people you meet." I met the most interesting people in Homeland Security. In agencies, I'm not sure I could remember the acronym, but in the end, I had a top secret security clearance, and state actors never before were given that access. And because of that, we were able to develop the techniques and the rubric for dealing with Homeland Security and protecting our people. I will say Homeland Security, the most exciting, again, the most challenging, but truly the most stressful job. Because in the end, a failure is one of catastrophic dimensions. I don't want to be facetious or too crass to say, in litigation, of course, you're dealing with, there's two parties, and just two parties, generally speaking. And as a judge, I'm dealing with, quote, just two parties. But in Homeland, the ramifications of things that we did, example, a decision to, quote, do nothing, because we got a warning that they're going to attack New York City. What do you do with that? That's not a sufficiently specific warning to do anything about, but it comes with catastrophic consequences if you are wrong. The flip side is we could command literally armies. I remember calling up the Adjutant General of the National Guard right after bombings in Europe, immediately about 2002, 2003. And the question was, how many soldiers can we mass quickly in New York City as National Guardsmen? And as I asked the question, I thought, who gave me the wisdom to do this? Where did I learn this? And the short answer is never, never. I was thrust into this, but it was a marvelous, marvelous learning experience, as stressful as it really was.
So, and I hope you don't think, or I'm really not trying to exaggerate, but having spent some time this semester reading about the founders in the late 18th century, very seriously, the legal training, the fact that you're a lawyer, that is the role of being a lawyer, that is when you're, constructing it at the same time you're operating it, it seems to me that the lawyer's role is even more valuable or even more indispensable if such a thing can be true.
It's essential. For any student watching this, please come to my office. I have a picture. It shows me from the back, and you can see the governor and 25 commissioners. We would have these meetings every other week. This is immediately after 9/11. And it was to coordinate response on the state level, because in the end, the federal government obviously has the assets and they ought to respond ultimately. But it works up local, state, federal. And in the end, we'd have proposals. I'm not going to share what some of the proposals are, but some were. And they would always turn to the few lawyers at the table and they would say, can we do this? And we would say, no, there is such a thing as the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment, and they didn't repeal it on 9/12. So in the end, the lawyer's role is the ultimate role in Homeland Security, because you can dream up all sorts of ideas, and the ideas have to pass muster, because the last thing you want is a situation in which the government is engaging in overreaching with the notion that it's going to, quote, do this to protect the people. And it's the tension that we teach in law school between the Constitution not being a suicide pact, but at the same time, the document that has survived for 240 years to protect the individuals. And so these concerns ranged from not only law enforcement, but how do we deal with health-related issues? To be very frank, we talked about biohazards, chemical hazards, radioactive hazards. We never, ever discussed what became the pandemic. It just didn't figure. Nobody really talked about that. But the real reality is all sorts of efforts were undertaken to coordinate, and the lawyer's role in all of this was the last role. They would always come and say, and ultimately come to me, because I'm supposed to be the Deputy Director of Homeland Security and Chief Counsel. I had lawyers working with me too, but in the end, I do mean in the end, you'd have to say yes or no. And then you'd have a governor who would say, I don't want to hear we could have done A or B when we didn't have this on the table. So it was a stressful time, because unlike today, in which the lines are relatively well defined at this point, how to respond to A, how to respond to B. I mean, I must say, we have domestic terror attacks. We have, unfortunately, mass shootings, et cetera. And these are a type of Homeland Security problems, but they're not of the type that we were dealing with at the time and still worry about. And that's, of course, international terrorism.
We have one more stop before we go to the Court of Appeals decision, which of course is your experience as a judge. And especially in light of, your experience, all those appellate briefs you wrote, all those cases you argued, and then this really advise and counsel role that you had at Homeland Security. How much was it? How difficult, or how much of a stretch was it when you became a judge, I think in 2006, to change your seat? That is to change your position in the courtroom, if we want to use that image.
Let me share two stories. First, I become a judge not in the normal way as a state judge. Most state judges in New York are elected. I actually was nominated by the governor and confirmed by the state Senate. But before that, I had to gain approval of a committee to evaluate my background and my qualifications, et cetera. Actually, you'd be very happy to know your whole life can be distilled into about 2 inches thick of paper. And I did it 3 different times. And as it went on over the years, the paper got thicker and thicker. So after doing it, I think I was reconfirmed again in 2018. I was reconfirmed in 09 and 18. It got this thick. But at the very first committee meeting in 2006, I was asked that very question. Look, you've been a prosecutor your whole life. and you've worked in Homeland Security now for the last, that was 5 years. How can you assure us that you will, quote, be fair? And what I reflected on was years ago, I sat on a committee in the Suffolk Bar Association about what makes a good judge. There are 4 qualifications. The most critical qualification, I'll give you others, scholarship, integrity, and the most important qualification, if you ask me, is temperament and integrity. Meaning, I am a very even person and a person always willing to listen. Can I tell you that 25 years, I just threw it out the window and I became a judge on a tabula rasa? I wish that were the case. It's not. You'll be happy to know that the first 4.5 years I served as a judge, I was in the state Supreme Court as a matrimonial judge. And I did divorces. And I tried many, many cases. And by the way, when I die, my obituary will read, he was the judge in the Christie Brinkley divorce case. So that was one aspect. But the second part is critical also. Being a judge demands patience. And patience to the point where I'm not sure I subscribe to the notion of being an umpire. I don't know that I would call myself a potted plant umpire. I have a job. My job is to deliver up fairness. If it's going to be a plea, be fair. If it's going to be a trial, be fair. If it's going to be a hearing, be fair. If it's a sentence, be fair. I'm going to tell you what demonstrated to me that I had removed, pardon me, my baggage, my shackles as a prosecutor early on. When I received a verdict as a trial lawyer, as a DA, the jury would enter the room. The jury would be seated. The judge would say, have you reached a verdict? If so, would the foreperson please rise? Would the defendant please rise? My heart was pounding, even though I knew I'd be going home no matter what. As a judge, when the same experience would happen over and over again, I had no reaction, flat, sort of like the line in a chorus line. I felt nothing, meaning all I was worried about was, did you deliver up a fair trial to both sides? And in the end, that proved to me I had no stake in the outcome. So much so, and I think you'll know what I'm talking about, after every verdict in any case, civil, criminal, matrimonial, the judge will go in the back ordinarily and talk to the jurors and say, thank you so much, we really need you, et cetera, et cetera. The first question of the jury will always be, did we do the right thing? Is it the right verdict? And you know what the answer is. The answer, and this is important for our students, the answer is whatever the verdict is the right thing. And that's the real joy of our democracy. Meaning, you talk about power to the people, however flawed we have problems in our country, we actually say to our fellow citizens, look, you decide this. You make a decision as to what the facts are, apply the law, and you tell us guilty or not guilty, liable or not liable, or divorce or not. I know we don't have fault divorce anymore, but in the end, it's the most marvelous thing. And I think as a judge, I projected in so many words, not I don't care, but the notion of equanimity. I really did not have a stake in the game. I can share with you, there are some judges that if there's an acquittal, they're not going to be happy. Cohen never cared. And I'll share with you also, I only had 2 non-jury trials. I guess they were not so sure about me. Both cases, I said to the lawyers, look, I don't think you should do it because I don't know what I'm going to do. And surely you don't know what I'm going to do. Guess what the verdicts were in both those non-jury cases? Mr. Prosecutor for 25 years.
You acquitted.
Both. Both.
That is.
And it's interesting because it taught me this is the way you have to behave. Not acquit every time, but in so many words, you have to be even. And that's what they have you take an oath to be. And I think it's important for lawyers and law students to recognize we're trained as lawyers, but that doesn't mean we need to approach it as a partisan or be contentious or anything else, but we actually are there to do the job. As a lawyer, you're an advocate. As a judge, you are an impartial arbiter of the law, and you are responsible for the proper flow of a trial. And I will tell you that just as I said to myself in Homeland Security, who gave me the wisdom to do this, meaning call out the National Guard. And when the judge didn't share this, the general said, how do you want them armed? And I thought, my God, I have no idea. And I said, I have no idea. And as a judge, it's the same thing. Who taught me how to be a fair and impartial arbiter of a trial? But yet you learn. We do have continuing judicial education. And I've wound up teaching at the Judicial Institute and dozens of judicial conferences because judges really want to do the right thing. So that's a long-winded answer.
Yeah, the only sort of, we're going to pivot in about, after one more comment in exchange, perhaps, the my impression, having, clerked for a trial court judge, as well as having known some people who have done it, including you, but the experience, one of the things that I think enables a trial court judge to be successful, that is, and you can debate the chicken and the egg about, is it the belief or the experience that feeds the, which feeds the other, but really the belief, the faith in the system. That is, this goes to, in part, there's a role for you, there's a role for the jury, but your belief in, there's a role for the prosecutor, there's a role for the defense attorney, that is the adversarial system and so on. That is, the people I know who have enjoyed being a judge, who have done it well, really trust the system in a sort of broad way. That is that, everyone has a role, and when people perform according to their roles, the system works, regardless of the outcome or whatever the outcome is.
I agree. I had a colleague years ago, a lawyer, tell me the juries get it right 19 of 20 times. That means they're wrong 5%. I actually have such faith in the system. I would say they get it wrong rarely. In other words, less frequently than 5%. I think jurors are smarter than we lawyers give them credit for being. I also think that jury trials are just utterly fabulous, again, because we give them the power to make the decision. And in the end, I think the faith in the system is what drives it. And I do agree with you. I think you're 100% right.